Today we'll be looking at interval notation. Our objectives will be to write open intervals, closed intervals, half-open intervals, and infinite intervals. We'll begin with open intervals, but before we actually start, I want to make sure that you understand what it is we're going to accomplish in this lesson. Given a set of numbers, in this case the numbers that are in between -2 and 5, not including those endpoints, what we want to do is to write this in another way. We simply don't want to write it as a set of inequalities, but instead we want to write it in what we call interval notation. For most of you, the easiest way to accomplish this will be to put in an in-between step, graphing on a number line. So that's what we'll do on this one. We want to begin then by graphing this on a number line. To graph this one, most of you would tell me that we should do an open circle at a -2, and we should do an open circle at 5, and we should shade the number line in between those two locations. And I would agree with you. I do want to point out though that this book does things just a tad different in this area. They will, instead of putting an open circle, they will put a parentheses here and a parentheses here. And really that's going to come in handy when we get to the part where we're doing interval notation. So let's look at how this would work. To write this in interval notation now, you would look at your number line and say what is the number that is farthest to the left that is shaded, and then how far do I continue to be shaded? Well, in this case the answer to the first question is the numbers start being shaded at -2 and they continue being shaded up to 5. Then you have to ask yourself what goes on the ends. And that's where using the parentheses on the number line really does come in handy, because it turns out that everywhere you would use a parentheses on the number line, you would use a parentheses in interval notation. Now let me stop here for just a second and make sure that you understand what it is we are writing. We are trying to write this set of numbers here in another way. And the way we're writing it is this. We will tell it where the set begins, what is the smallest number, where the set ends, what is the larger number, and then whether or not the endpoints are included. So this is another way of accomplishing that. Let's look now at one for you to do. I'd like for you to practice writing this open interval. First of all, you'll want to start by graphing it on a number line. You may want to pause the video, see if you can draw the number line correctly, and then write it in correct interval notation. Let's look at how it would be on a number line. I would have an open circle at 1, an open circle at 6, and I would shade the number line in between. Remember that this would be the same as writing this with parentheses. Then in correct scientific notation, it would look like this. Open parentheses, 1, 6, close parentheses. That says the interval starts with 1, continues to 6, and does not include the end pieces. Now I know you have some questions about what I mean when I say open and closed intervals. So let's move now to a closed interval, and hopefully I can answer some of those. In a closed interval, we'll see that we have less than or equal to symbols here. That will change the way it looks on our number line. So let's look at that. This time we would have a closed circle at -1, a closed circle at 3, and we would shade the number line in between. Well, in this text, instead of using a parentheses, since this has the equal to with it, we would use a bracket. Once again, that'll come in handy as we write our interval notation. In this case, the interval would be from -1 to 3, exactly what you see shaded on the number line, with brackets on each end. What I'd like to do now is give you one to try. So let me ask you to do this closed interval. You may want to pause the video, do this, and come back and check. This time we would have a closed circle at -2, a closed circle at 0, and we would shade in between. To write this then in interval notation, it would be -2, 0, with brackets on both ends since both symbols have an equal to with them. Let's now look at a half-open interval. Notice that this time one of the symbols has an equal to and the other one does not. That's what we'll be looking at when we look at a half-open interval. Let's graph this one now on a number line. This time we would have a solid circle at -2 and we would have an open circle at 0. Remember that we would shade in between, but I also want to remind you that when we use solid circles we use brackets, and when we use open circles we use parentheses. So our half-open interval this time would look like this in interval notation. -2, 0, with a bracket on the left and a parentheses on the right. I do want to make sure that you notice that it's perfectly okay for these end pieces not to match. This is not a case where you say I open a parentheses and I must close a parentheses, or since I've opened a bracket I have to close a bracket. You are indicating two individual end pieces when you do those brackets and parentheses. They are dependent on these symbols up here. If it is an equal to with it, it has a bracket. If it does not have an equal to, you use a parentheses. Let's look at another half-open interval together, and then I'll let you practice. This time we want to draw this one on a number line, and we would have an open circle at -2 and a closed circle at 0. We would still shade in between, and let me remind you, this one would be a parentheses, this one would be your bracket. To write this then in interval notation, it would be -2, 0, and the end pieces would be just like they look on the number line. Now I'd like to give you a half-open interval for you to do. You may want to pause the video and try this one. You'll still want to graph it on a number line. We'll have an open circle at -3, a closed circle at a +2, and we would shade in between. Remember, this is your open parentheses, this will be a bracket, and so your interval notation would look like this: -3, 2, with the parentheses on the left-hand side and the bracket on the right. I have another one for you to try, so let me let you do this one. Pause again and come back and check. To graph this one, we would have a solid circle at -1, an open circle at +2, and we would shade in between. There's your square bracket, there's your open parentheses, and so let's look at what your interval notation would be written like. What I'd like to do now is look at infinite intervals. So let's look at x is less than 2. We still want to start by graphing it on a number line. This time we would have an open circle at 2, and we would shade to the left since it's less than. How far does that continue? Infinitely far? Well, let me remind you that this is the symbol for infinity, and because it is a negative on this end, we will put a negative infinity. If we were going the other direction, we would use a positive infinity symbol. So over here we have negative infinity. Well, once again we're going to write our interval notation by looking at the number line. If you read it from left to right, the first thing you see here is negative infinity, comma, 2. That's how far we continue to be shaded. And on this end, we know we should have a parentheses here. And let me tell you a fail-safe rule for the other end. Anytime you have an infinity symbol, whether it is positive or negative, you will always write a parentheses next to it. Let me say that another way. You will never correctly put a square bracket next to an infinity symbol, either positive or negative, in interval notation. Let's look at another infinite interval. This time we have x is greater than 4. To draw that on a number line, we would have an open circle at 4. We would shade to the right. How far do we shade? To infinity? Let me just put that there to remind us of that. And by the way, that little infinity symbol just kind of looks like an 8 laying down on its side. This time what we want to do is we want to write this in interval notation. Notice if you look at your number line from left to right, the first thing that you see that is shaded is the 4. And how far does it continue to be shaded? To positive infinity. This is the first thing you see shaded from left to right, and how far does it continue? Because this is an open circle, remember, that will be a parentheses, and we always place a parentheses next to an infinity symbol. Let's look at one now that has an equal to instead of just a greater than. We still want to graph it on our number line. This time it would be a solid circle right there. We would shade to the right. It would continue to infinity. And let me remind you, that is still right there. This time our interval notation would look like this. Notice the change is that this is now a bracket on this end because it's an equal to here, a solid circle. Let me now give you an infinite interval to do. Try this one first, graph it, then write it in interval notation, and then come back and check. We would have a solid circle at positive 1. We would shade to the left since it is less than, and we would be shading this time infinitely far, let me remind you, in the direction of negative infinity. To write this in interval notation, you still write it in the order that it appears on the number line. That means we would start with our negative infinity, we would continue to 1, always the parentheses on this end because it's next to the infinity symbol. This time the square bracket goes with the closed circle, so we have a square bracket on this end. And now I want to look at infinite intervals when you have more than one of them. So let's look at this situation. What happens when I have x is less than or equal to 1 or x is greater than or equal to 3? Well, let's graph that on a number line and then we'll see how to write it in interval notation. We'll start with our solid circle at x is equal to 1, and we'll shade to the left since it's less than, and we will shade all the way to negative infinity. The other one we'll go in and put on this same number line. We'll have a solid circle at 3. We'll shade to the right infinitely far, and I'm going to put that infinity symbol to remind us of that again. I want you to notice that anytime we have a break, like we have right here, where the intervals are not connected, if there's a gap that is not shaded, then you will need to do the step I'm about to do. You will actually write this as two separate intervals and then connect them with the union symbol. Anytime you see the word or, the symbol that we'll use to connect our intervals is the union symbol. So let's look at what this would look like. The first piece would be negative infinity to 1. That's this interval right here. It started at negative infinity, continued to be shaded up to 1, with a parentheses on this end and a square bracket here. We then say we have another piece to include, and that is the union symbol right there, and then here comes the second piece. Starts with a square bracket, 3, comma, and how far does it continue? To infinity. Close with a parentheses, always next to that infinity symbol. I have one now for you to try. Please pause the video and do this one. We'll put it on a number line. It would be an open circle and shade to the left. How far? To negative infinity. I think it really helps if you write those infinity symbols there. Then on this side we have a solid circle and we're going to shade to the right. Once again, we'll be going to positive infinity. How would this look in interval notation? On the left-hand end, we would have negative infinity, and it continues to be shaded to negative 1. Open circle tells us it will be a parentheses. Unioned, because we see the or, we'll start with a square bracket from 2 to positive infinity. I think that's about all the interval notation you can stand for one day. I want to leave you with this thought. Wisdom is what's left over after we've run out of personal opinions. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.